All right, welcome everybody. My name is Lori Peterson, and I'm one of the U.S. chairs for the PSC Southern Panel and serve as the Fish Science Division Manager at the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Thank you very much for being here today and taking the time to attend our seminar, which is titled Hatchery-Wild Interactions in the Columbia Basin and Salish Sea, presented by Dr. Robert Lackey from Oregon State University and Adam Silverstein from Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And Adam is graciously presenting on behalf of David Willis, who is out sick, unfortunately. So thank you, Adam, for filling in. And Adam is very familiar, works with David at DFO Canada. So this seminar is part of a PSC Seminar Series titled Environmental Change in Pacific Salmon Management, the view from both sides of the border. Today is the 18th installment of that series. The series was launched in 2021 by the Southern Panel and Coho Technical Committee in collaboration with the Secretariat and the Committee on Scientific Cooperation. For those of you who are new to this seminar series, as a bit of background, the series is intended to provide the latest information on environmental variation and its effects on salmon across their life cycle. Our approach is to address this variability in salmon management from both Western and Indigenous perspectives. These monthly events, like today's, have featured noted speakers from both the US and Canada to discuss a variety of salient, really relevant and interesting topics like we have today. Links to recorded past seminars can be found both on the PSC's website or on our PSC YouTube channel. And if you just go to YouTube and search for the Pacific Salmon Commission, you'll find that about 17 or so of our past recorded seminars will come up and you can watch them. As you may know, these seminars, such as today's, are limited to the PSC family members as delegates from Canada and the United States, but the video links, of course, are open to the general public. And we have had quite a bit of interest in those. As a preview, future seminars will be scheduled throughout 2024. Potential topics include interspecies dynamics, such as carrying capacity, pink salmon competition, range shifts, hypoxia, ocean acidification and upwelling, harmful algal blooms, biological oceanography and salmon prey, fishery planning models of the future, toxins, indigenous fisheries management in the Yukon, resist accept direct framework for salmon, monitoring and assessment systems, how fishery managers are responding to climate change, including new management strategies. And that's just a sampling of just a wide variety of topics that the steering committee is considering speakers for. In the near term, we have the next seminar already set for January 9th. It's during the PSC postseason meeting at the Hyatt Regency in Seattle, Washington, from 12 noon to 1:30. We will feature a roundtable type panel discussion of commercial, recreational, and tribal and First Nations fishing community perspectives to increasing environmental variation, featuring key representatives from Canada and the US. So be sure to attend that one on the Tuesday of our PSC postseason meeting. But zeroing in on today's presentation, once again, the seminar is titled Hatchery-Wild Interactions in the Columbia Basin and Salish Sea, presented by Dr. Robert Lackey from Oregon State University and Adam Silverstein from DFO Canada. So following the two presentations, we will take a short 5-minute break. People can post their questions or thoughts in the chat feature of Zoom. And then we'll begin a moderated question and answer session with Marie Salit and Lori Whitecamp to allow you to ask your questions and get a little more in depth into some of these issues. So now I'll give a bit of a bio on each of our speakers. First of all, Dr. Robert T. Lackey will be our first presenter with a talk titled Columbia River Basin: How would ending fisheries and hatcheries change wild salmon, and steelhead abundance. Dr. Bob Lackey is a professor of fisheries science at Oregon State University. In 2008, he retired after 27 years with the Environmental Protection Agency's National Research Laboratory in Corvallis, Oregon. He served as Deputy Director, Associate Director for Science, and other senior science leadership positions. Since his first fisheries and wildlife job as an undergraduate student mucking out raceways in a trout hatchery, he has worked on various environmental and natural resource issues from multiple positions in government and academia. His professional assignments involve diverse and politically contentious issues, but he mainly operated at the interface of science and policy. He has published hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific articles and reports, authored many more for general audiences, and is a fellow of the American Fishery Society and the American Institute of Fishery Research Biologists. Dr. Lackey has long been an educator, having taught at 5 North American universities and currently teaches a graduate course in ecological policy at Oregon State University. Canadian by birth, he is now a U.S.-Canadian dual citizen living in Corvallis, Oregon. So thank you for being here, Dr. Lackey. And then for our second presenter, we'll feature Adam Silverstein in for David Willis with a talk titled Hatchery Adaptation and Climate Change. So as some background on Adam, currently Adam is the Salmonid Enhancement Program Manager for Hatchery Reform and Modernization at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Canada. This work includes developing a hatchery adaptation strategy for DFO and developing a new hatchery infrastructure announced as part of the Pacific Salmon Strategic Initiative. Adam has worked in environmental conservation for the federal government for 25 years and has worked for DFO on salmon conservation for 19 years, 15 of that in various roles with the Salmonid Enhancement Program, including 2 years as the acting director of the Salmonid Enhancement Program. Adam has also managed DFO's habitat regulatory and habitat restoration programming across the Pacific region. So welcome to Adam as well. But now, without further ado, I will turn it over to our first presenter, Dr. Bob Lackey.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute to this seminar series. My task today for the Columbia River Basin is to answer 3 key policy questions. First, do hatcheries help or hurt the recovery of wild runs? Second, is fishing having a substantial effect, positive or negative, on the recovery of wild runs? And third, perhaps the most politically charged, are hatcheries and big wild runs mutually exclusive? Your task today, decide how much of what you hear is applicable elsewhere. But first, a bit of essential context. For millennia, the range of these species has been the Pacific and surrounding North Pacific and surrounding basins. As climate changed, and it did many times, the distribution expanded and shrunk, especially at the southern ends. That is, on the eastern side, modern-day California, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And on the western side, China, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan. However, currently, Pacific salmon are also found in New Zealand, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Falkland Islands, the North American Great Lakes, the US, Canadian, and Russian Arctic Ocean, Iceland, Scotland, Norway, Sweden, northwestern Russia, and who knows where pink salmon have turned up this month. Most definitely, Pacific salmon are a resilient, highly adaptable species. But from here on, I'm only going to focus on a single North Pacific location, the Columbia River Basin. Also, when I say salmon, I include steelhead. Although it is only a single river basin, it covers an Alberta-sized slice of real estate. Standing in the US, looking north across the 49th parallel, perhaps the BC portion appears small. These days, even inconsequential, from a salmon perspective, but it is not. Yes, the Canadian portion is only 15% of the basin's land area, but it stores more than a third of the snowpack. And several mammoth Canadian dams serve as gigantic storage containers, as well as producing substantial amounts of electricity. Further, it is the 4 Canadian Columbia River dams that allow for the full power generation year-round from the U.S. portion of the main stem Columbia, rather than being limited to historically high runoff months. So much for the 1-minute hydrology lesson. Now for a synopsis of the human footprint on the basin. For humans, the basin's indigenous population peaked around 1,500, perhaps at 1 million, but then began a steep decline, largely caused by the old world diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, and eventually dropped by about 90%. So by the early 1800s, the human population, being almost entirely indigenous, was very low. Thus, the effect of humans on salmon abundance was not zero, but it was not dominant. Things changed in the mid-1800s. Today, the basin's human population is around 5 million and heading for more than 10 million by the end of this century. Moving to salmon, estimates vary of the pre-1850 aggregate basin salmon run, but nearly all fall between 5 and 15 million. More recent work puts the number towards the lower end, perhaps 6 or 7 million. Sure, there were big, disruptive natural events, such as the massive collapse of Table Rock in the 1400s, just upriver from Portland, creating a 170-mile, 300-foot deep lake, completely blocking the mid and upper Columbia to migrating salmon for a decade or two. Think about that. No salmon reaching the mid and upper Columbia for decades. What a demonstration of resilience. But since the 1800s, ignorance is not an excuse, a creditable excuse for what happened. For example, in the 1860s, with the adoption of modern canning technology, concurrent with the proliferation of railroads, commercial fishing shifted into high gear, and that was just a start. By the 1890s, well over a century ago, the head of what is now the U.S. National Marine Fisheries Service pleaded for something to be done to restore the dramatically depleted salmon runs, roughly a 75% reduction overall, well before any main stem dams. One well-known example of societal policy choices in the 1930s and 1940s, a sequential suite of salmon policy drivers burst on the scene. Initially, the responses to the Depression, followed by preparations for a likely war, and then the Second World War itself. There were many other trade-offs, to be sure, but people realized that the choices that were made would not be good for wild salmon. A bit of caution here. Even with solid data, and anyone who has ever evaluated run data knows this graph is just too textbook perfect. But what is apparent is the general long-term pattern, but even that long-term pattern is often disrupted by so-called good and bad ocean conditions. The familiar Pacific decadal oscillations and similar phenomena are somewhat appreciated, but also there are variations in terrestrial climate that also affect salmon abundance. However, the overall 173-year downward trend is unmistakable, and it continues. Okay, that was the past. Now, for the rest of this talk, I'll focus on the most likely future of the basin salmon, in particular, the future of wild salmon. But first, let's acknowledge a few facts. One obvious reality, nowadays, there are few wild salmon returning to the Columbia. Why? 40% of the basin that once supported wild salmon no longer does, mostly due to dams. And much of the remaining basin is highly altered. Second, of the current total basin run, that is both wild and hatchery, about 4 in every 5 started life in a hatchery. Third, over the past 40 years, roughly $9 billion has been spent by the U.S. federal and state governments in efforts to sustain, much less recover, the runs. If the foregone revenue and opportunity costs are included, the total expenditure leaps to an even bigger number. And fourth, yeah, sure, everybody cheerleads reversing the downward trend in the basin, but enthusiasm drops off when realistic policy trade-offs are explained and monetary and non-monetary costs are included. For example, consider the consequences for wild salmon of the additional 5 to 10 million basin residents in 2100, as well as the 30 to 40 million more people calling the Pacific Northwest home. As for selecting an overarching salmon recovery strategy for the basin, some argue that hatcheries are just about the worst option. Conversely, others believe that the little remaining salmon fishing would not be possible without annually stocking more than 140 million smolts pumped out of the basin's 208 fish hatcheries. Second, regarding commercial, recreational, and tribal fishing, various advocates assert that continued harvesting of hatchery salmon keeps wild salmon numbers low. Stop all fishing, they argue, and wild salmon abundance would rebound. Is that true? Third, how much good have the billions of dollars spent actually done for wild salmon, other than to employ thousands of people like me and some of you to fatten up at the public trough? Sorry, an awkward question, most definitely. Okay, what type of information is required to answer these fundamental policy relevant questions? My first choice is what is commonly regarded as science, the process of testing hypotheses in a rational, systematic, testable, and reproducible manner. You need all 4 for the scientific method. But to be amenable to the scientific method, the research questions, the hypotheses, are necessarily simplified. Alternatively, experiential knowledge is ubiquitous in fisheries management and policy, and it can address complex research questions, but it does not meet the 4 rigorous requirements of the scientific method. However, what about scientific experts who use a blend of science and personal experiential knowledge, and thus, arguably, provide the most credible answer to complex policy and management questions? But a cautionary note. What about employment or personal policy bias? Once you cajole scientific experts into participating, their answers presented in public are often very different than their answers offered in private. In my experience, anonymity is essential. Given all this, how can the most credible and most policy relevant answers be obtained? My answer was to perform a simple thought experiment, but one with promised anonymity for all participants. First, I created a long list of senior scientists who had extensive research and management experience with basin salmon issues. All were what any of us would classify as a who's who of scientific experts. Second, right from my first contact, I promised complete anonymity Interestingly, from the start, many participants expressed appreciation for being able to answer questions bluntly and candidly, free of pressure from employers, colleagues, or advocacy organizations. Third, questions were strictly science or fact-based. I did not push any particular policy goal or management approach, nor did I ever ask participants for their views about which policy goal or approach should be adopted. First, from an initial list of 100 experts, I was able to find email contact information for 96. Standard email requests were sent to those 96. Second, 67 responded to the first or second email. As surveys go, this is a very high response rate. Third, 60 of the 67 agreed to participate. Of the 7 who declined, 2 did so because, and I'm paraphrasing here, the likely results will be used by opposing advocates to undermine our preferred policy position. The reality, this is a highly charged political issue, and science is often an effective advocacy weapon in such disputes. Fourth, ultimately, 58 of the 60 answered the question. Their actual responses are posted at my Oregon State University website. Okay, what question exactly was asked? This is the question asked of all participants. In essence, all of a sudden, assume no hatcheries and no fishing. What would happen to Columbia River Basin wild salmon? To allow time for their runs to adjust to this new reality, that is, no fishing and no hatcheries, I asked respondents to allow a couple of decades for the runs to adjust. Many respondents provided a single sentence answer with little, if any, elaboration. Others provided pages of detailed explanation, justifying each step in the thought process. Well, the bottom line, what do experts think would happen to the abundance of wild salmon in the Columbia River Basin without hatcheries and no fishing? Think for a second. What would your answer be? First off, more than 4 in 5 respondents, that's 83%, predicted that the current total salmon abundance, that is both hatchery and wild, would decline. Many of the 83% expected the resulting total run, which would be only wild, to sink to a much, much lower number, some to even less than the already very low current wild run. No one predicted complete extirpation of salmon from the basin, but most expected that the current total run, a couple of decades after closing hatcheries and stopping fishing, would decline greatly. Presumably, so much so that little or no sustainable harvest would be feasible. Examining the alternative possible outcome, only 1 in 20 predicted that wild runs overall would be higher than current total run. So what is the take-home policy message? Here's the bottom line for managers, policymakers, politicians, and the public. According to the experts, eliminating all salmon and steelhead fishing and closing all basin fish hatcheries would not greatly change the abundance of the basin's wild salmon and steelhead. Of course, hatchery runs would go to zero. Essentially, 20 years after stopping fishing and closing hatcheries, there would likely be many fewer total salmon, but roughly the same number of wild salmon as now. Yeah, some expected perhaps a tad more, but most respondents predicted the same or fewer or a lot fewer wild salmon. The key point, almost every respondent predicted that after 20 years, there would be a smaller total run in the basin than today, a drop from about 1 to 2 million total salmon to probably 200,000 to 300,000 wild salmon, about 3 to 5% of the 1850s abundance. ESA levels, not fishable runs. So what are the implications? First, right off the top, the current fishable salmon runs in the basin are largely sustained by hatchery releases. Essentially, no hatcheries, no fishing. Second, implicit in the results, hatcheries don't seem to have much effect on the abundance of wild runs, except to provide a lot of strays and end up spawning. Third, even success in ESA delisting will not likely mean that there are fishable runs. Wild runs less than 5% of historical levels are generally not fishable on a sustained basis. And fourth, without the pre-1850 climate and the unaltered conditions in the basin, big runs of wild salmon are not realistic. Okay, an anonymous survey of experts is one approach, but are there other ways to answer such a question? Let me dramatically shift gears here and present a very different approach. The effectiveness of the basin's massive salmon recovery efforts can be assessed by computing society's return on investment. Recovery programs are expensive, and the nagging unknown is always, how effective were those expenditures in increasing or even sustaining wild or hatchery runs? Good question, but how to answer? To start, we have 4 decades of pretty good Columbia River data, run data. It's not perfect, but it's quite good as fisheries data goes. Further, we also have a pretty good estimate of the dollar cost of salmon recovery programs over the past 40 years. Okay, the crucial policy question is, what did the public get for all this restoration money? Yes, a lot of money was spent over the years, and one oft-stated purpose was to recover wild salmon. Did it? As luck would have it, one of my Oregon State University colleagues, an economist, Bill Jager, and a USGS biologist just published such an analysis. Here's a synopsis, hot off the press. First, $9 billion has been spent directly by governments to restore salmon in the basin. And of course, the direct expenditure is conservative because it does not include the so-called foregone revenue and opportunity costs. Their overall conclusion, after 40 years of restoration efforts, there were no net benefits from such expenditures. In other words, spending $9 billion made no measurable difference in salmon runs. Zero. Not what anyone wants to hear, right? More directly relevant to the topic today, they also considered the restoration programs relative to wild salmon, and they failed miserably. Thus, their results are broadly consistent with my survey. Perhaps recovery programs did benefit salmon on a local scale, but there is no overall measurable improvement despite spending billions. Astonishingly, when the facts seem so apparent, how has this sobering reality persisted for at least 4 decades? To answer, let me hypothesize, let me speculate. Think back to when you sat in the back row of Political Science 101. Never short of answers, political scientists will readily offer 2 likely and familiar reasons for this apparent illusion. First, policy domestication. It is ever so tempting for politicians to neutralize, to domesticate a nasty political conflict by inundating it with heaps of money. After all, your friendly, ever-responsive government is spending billions to fund the salmon recovery industry. Essentially, the political position is, let's not do anything unpopular until the experts do what they can do with all this money. Yes, tried and true symbolic politics. Second, in that same political science class, if you were still listening, you might have heard something about policy advocates masquerading as scientists. Yes, a portion of the scientific information that government officials, politicians, and most important, the public, actually hear is provided by such folks. Those who cloak themselves in the accoutrements of science, but actually offer nothing but policy advocacy masquerading as science. But there's a third component to the answer: ecological reality. One key ecological reality often overlooked: many of the basin's fish species are doing exceptionally well. For example, the most abundant anadromous fish in the basin these days is not a species of salmon or steelhead, but American shad, an introduced species that is very abundant. Similarly, walleye, smallmouth bass, northern pike, and many others provide world-class fishing opportunities, but not salmon or steelhead. Yes, good old biology 101, an unsurprising change given the highly altered status of the basin, coupled with a different climate more than 200 years ago. Let me wrap up with a few take-home messages. First, the decline of wild salmon should not be much of a surprise. After all, the main policy drivers are broadly known. Second, to change any of these policy drivers requires substantial economic and lifestyle changes from the residents of the region. Engineering and other tweaks will not do it. Third, perhaps it is time to engage the public and politicians in a serious discussion about whether the billions being spent to recreate substantial wild runs has any prospect of success. I'll close by shifting from hardcore analysis to empathetic opinion. Beginning with a very big piece of real estate, the Columbia River Basin, some 200 plus years ago, David Thompson, David Douglas, Meriwether Lewis, and William Clark described its salmon runs to the world. And yes, I know their time was different, including the weather. For example, near present-day Portland, 2 centuries ago, in some years, even the Great Columbia River itself was ice-covered. Wagons could be driven across the entire width for weeks on end. And there were curling matches on the river near present-day Portland. Indeed, it must have been a great time to be a salmon. Beyond changing climate, what played out over the ensuing 2 centuries for salmon should not be surprising, and it was broadly predictable. People sought a better life for their families. They needed to eat. They detested floods. They demanded wars be won. They voted for candidates that promised cheap, reliable electricity, and much, much more. Old news for sure. And there is nothing wrong or right about those policy choices. For those of us who make our living in the salmon recovery industry, perhaps it is past time to ditch our comforting illusions. As well, it is surely past time to banish groundless optimism, and equally important, to avoid deceptive pessimism. Instead, it is time for blunt, accurate appraisals about the future of the basin's wild salmon and steelhead runs. Nothing more and nothing less is warranted. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Lackey. Very thought-provoking and powerful presentation. Thank you. And now it's time for our second speaker who can share his screen. Adam Silverstein will be our second presenter with a talk titled Hatchery Adaptation and Climate Change. Right.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me here, and apologies that the original presenter, Dave Willis, isn't here to do a much better job than I likely could. It is very challenging to follow such a distinguished and practiced lecturer like Dr. Lackey, and yeah, humbled to have the chance to do that. I am going to give a bit of an overview of hatchery production in Canada and some of the work underway to adapt that programming in the face of many of the challenges around climate change. So I think some of the points that I have will be quite familiar to the group, and some may be some new information about work we're doing. I think some of the key themes that you'll probably hear from me as I go through this material are around the use of enhancement as a strategic or tool and a balanced approach to that use. And also tailoring that use dependent on the local conditions and geography. My good friend and colleague Ryan Galbraith likes to use the analogy of a tool, and I think the salmon enhancement program perspective is that this is a tool that we need to use effectively, but a tool is like a hammer. It can be used to build things, but it can also be used to cause a great deal of harm. And so there is a need to carefully manage the use of that tool and to tailor that use to the context. I also think there is a need for increased education and understanding about enhancement and its benefits and its risks, and the role it can play in a salmon management context. That there are within the fisheries world a lot of knowledge, but there in the broader policy and decision-making world and in the public, there isn't necessarily a broad understanding of the role of hatcheries and the impacts of hatcheries. I'll give a bit of background around the Canadian enhancement context. I'm just, in the interest of time, will fly through some examples of the challenges we're already experiencing due to climate change impacts, and then talk about some of the efforts underway and what more needs to be done to improve the use of hatcheries as a tool to help with climate resiliency. So I think the other things you'll see woven through the talk here are that hatcheries are both subject to the effects of climate change, but they're also a tool that we can use to help mitigate some of those impacts, or to allow for some of the benefits while we work to address some of the other challenges or adjust to what is likely to be a very different future. So in Canada, we have 3 very different types of facilities, all operated under the umbrella of the Salmon Enhancement Program. So we have large facilities that are owned and operated by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and encompass the vast majority, close to 90% of our hatchery production. We have partner facilities that we provide direct support to Indigenous groups and other not-for-profit societies that operate these facilities with some professional management and some technical support and oversight from DFO, as well as direct funding. And then we have a fairly large number of smaller stewardship volunteer operated hatcheries that we provide much smaller amounts of funding and technical support to, and they're largely operated by volunteers across the region. And so one thing that is important to think about when we're managing enhancement in BC and in Canada is that we have to address all 3 of these different types of facilities and objectives, and they all have different needs. The other factor that is emerging in Canada is a very large demand for more hatchery production, both from Indigenous groups and from other sectors as well. The capacity, the funding, the legislative environment, the habitat environment, the fisheries context, the management context, the Indigenous context in Canada are all dramatically different than most of the United States. Also, much of our infrastructure has been developed in a very different time with different context and objectives. And most of that may not necessarily be aligned with what the future is going to look like in terms of our needs for enhancement and responding to salmon abundance. This is a brief overview of the basically the geographic area of production, and this production is just the hatchery production. It doesn't include our fairly large sockeye spawning channels. It's been the distribution is quite notable here, and it is not necessarily aligned with our biggest watersheds and our biggest conservation concerns now and into the future. Just another way to visualize the production from DFO hatcheries, and this does include our spawning channels. That production has been relatively stable over time. There have been more recent reductions on chum and pink production and some coho for various reasons. But overall, this production is only about 3 to 6% in any given year of the total releases into the North Pacific. So I'd like to dive into some of the things that we're experiencing. Dr. Lackey talked quite a bit about the human impacts in the Columbia Basin, and we definitely have those, but to different degrees across British Columbia and the Yukon. But we're also seeing dramatic changes and shifts in terms of natural events, and the second half of the talk around how we're trying to address these, I think it's important to have some of this context. So wildfire is a huge challenge across British Columbia and the Yukon. We've had a number of our facilities directly threatened by wildfire, and certainly wildfire is having a huge impact across the landscape. Flooding has also become a significant concern. We had a massive event around this time 2 years ago that nearly destroyed a number of our facilities. Spyas Creek Hatchery completely lost its intake, and big chunks of the facility infrastructure and equipment, and the Nicola watershed as a whole experienced dramatic reshaping of the entire watershed. Even our small community hatcheries are subject to these impacts. Oldfield Creek Hatchery is outside Prince Rupert, British Columbia, which is already one of the rainiest places on Earth, and unprecedented volumes of water have led to debris slides and other events there that destroyed that hatchery. Conversely, we're also experiencing the opposite problem, extreme drought. We continue to be in the middle of that drought this fall. This summer on the Fraser River, water levels were lowest recorded in many years, and some of the infrastructure designed to help salmon pass larger flows actually impeded salmon migration and resulted in the need for emergency response and in direct mortality. So, you know, all of these risks are kind of obvious at a macro level, but we need to look at the linkages between these vulnerabilities and how we're trying to use hatcheries as a tool to support some resiliency in these salmon systems. Just a couple other quick concepts to run through here in terms of some of the impacts we're seeing. These next couple of slides are the impacts of forestry in the Fraser watershed and some of its key tributaries. So you can see the difference between the 1980s and the late 2010s here between these two slides in terms of watershed cover and all the attendant impacts that can have on stream flow and temperature, et cetera. Similarly, the horsefly watershed is a major sockeye and Chinook producer and does support coho and pink as well. And these watersheds have experienced dramatic change. I don't think any of these things are going to come as a surprise to those on the call, but coupled with fire, increase in intense precipitation or drought, these impacts are accelerating rapidly. Just a quick overview here of the current conservation status. So in the early 2000s, the conservation unit is the measure of biodiversity used in Canada, and our wild salmon policy. And in the early 2000s, you can see kind of a mixed status report on different species in the Fraser watershed. But already in the late 2010s, those statuses have all followed the trend that was observed in Dr. Lackey's talk, and those trends are continuing into the 2020s. So what role can hatcheries play to foster some resiliency in the context of all these changes? I think they can be a tool to support some resiliency, but and it's a big but, I think, as Dr. Lackey's talk also pointed out, there are a lot of things that have to come to fruition to support that. And in particular, infrastructure, hatchery infrastructure, and the programs they deliver must be resilient to both expected and unexpected changes, and hatchery programming needs to adapt and shift with these changes. So I've stolen this slide from my DFO colleague Sue Grant, which I think is helpful to illustrate the broader approach around climate change and resiliency and adaptations needed. And I think these apply very well to how we use hatcheries as a tool for salmon recovery and conservation, and understanding the likely trajectory of many of the populations that we are trying to support, and how future scenarios are likely to play out as well. And I think that gets to the point of, the concept of rebuilding salmon populations versus envisioning likely future scenarios and managing to achieve a reasonable outcome in the context of those scenarios, as opposed to trying to recover some previous level that is likely not possible. So what can be done in the hatchery environment to address some of these challenges and to respond to some of these challenges? I'm going to go through a few quick categories here of these different opportunities, and one at a time. So infrastructure, fish culture, production planning, research and experimentation, and of course, leadership and cooperation. There we go. So, frequently when talking about hatcheries, infrastructure is the first thing that we need to talk about and we need to address. And we have a lot of work underway in Canada right now, critical to building that resiliency, protecting the infrastructure from floods, fires, loss of water supply, increasing the adaptability and flexibility of those infrastructures. So, for example, moving to more smaller modular circular tubs and away from large concrete raceways, securing safe water supply, UV disinfection, filtration, chillers, those types of measures are all underway. But while that progress is happening, it is slow and there is a massive need, and failing to meet those shifts is dramatically going to impact the ability to use this as a tool to moderate the future changes that are coming. And in particular, we saw with the big bar slide in 2019, the impact the lack of infrastructure had in our ability to respond. So not just managing our existing infrastructure, but developing new infrastructure or managing existing infrastructure to be able to respond to those types of needs is critical. In addition to the infrastructure piece, how we use that infrastructure in terms of fish health and fish culture is critical. and we need to be prepared to adapt our practices to do that. If we don't, the fish health management plan, excuse me, hatcheries that don't adjust their fish culture processes are going to release fish too early, too large, or poor quality. Our egg and gamete survivals may drop. Our brood collection will be challenged. Our transport operations are also becoming longer and longer to meet some of the conservation needs. And this can have significant impacts on the objectives that we're seeking to use these facilities for. A few observations on some of the effects we're seeing here is an increase in the length of broodstock holding time, shorter egg take seasons, more challenge in getting brood from the complete run timing of different runs, lower egg to fry survival rate due to temperature extremes. As well, many of our incubation development models that we use to predict landmarks in terms of fish development are based on coastal or Georgia Basin stocks, and much of the hatchery conservation needs are moving towards stocks with different life history and biology in the Upper Fraser Basin and Skeena, and these may need to be updated. We also have shorter times to rear fish to the appropriate size. They may be ponded later. They may need to be released earlier due to their receiving environment becoming too warm too quickly. This can also pose challenges for marking and assessment programs, because raising fish to the appropriate size to be clipped in time for release can also be challenging. So there also may be needs to change hatchery fish rearing conditions to minimize hatchery-wild interactions. And we also need to think about what are we doing in terms of more intense fish culture methods, such as captive brood, and whether or not those fish can ultimately return to their natal streams. So we are fortunate to be dealing with a species that does have a lot of ability to adapt, but we do have constraints in terms of how we use this tool, and we need to make those adjustments in order to effectively deliver on the objectives that people are seeking from our hatcheries. Of course, in order to do all this, we need more effective planning. And planning production is notoriously difficult and challenging, in part because the timelines are different than annual fisheries planning and many other annual planning processes that happen in fisheries management. We're planning our production in a given year, but the impacts of that production or the results of that production aren't going to appear in the environment for 2 to 5 years down the road. And it is a challenge to do that planning, that longer term planning on an annual basis, and align it with other sectors or other management tools that are operating on different timeframes. The other challenges in terms of this production planning is being very clear and detailed about the objectives of that production. Lots of effort have occurred in the United States around hatchery reform, and those efforts are now being expanded in Canada, which is extremely helpful. But there is much work to do, and change is notoriously difficult in hatchery programming in Canada. So we need to develop structures that enable an engagement with both internal to government and external partners that will allow us to make some of those changes. We also have difficult choices to make. Many of our most intense fish culture operations are around stocks that are likely have very low long-term viability. And we need to make difficult choices about whether we continue enhancing those stocks to maintain some genetic material from those populations, or whether we adjust and target other populations where we may be able to have a greater impact. The other factor that we experience is developing the necessary infrastructure, changing these practices, changing the production, and then the outcomes of that production are another few years down the road. Making that change takes a long time, and the changes that are experiencing in the environment are happening much more quickly than the current systems we have to enable these change. So how do we shift our systems to respond in that environment? Well, my slides are skipping around, so apologies if they're moving a little bit quickly here for you. This is just a quick slide to illustrate an example around that production planning. So we already have information that clearly shows the distribution and favorable habitat for salmon populations is already changing and is expected to change more. And we have some very challenging decisions around our enhancement programming to make about whether we're adjusting our program to respond to these changes, whether we're adjusting our program to contribute to the mitigation of some of these changes, or to meet real long-term needs, which are likely going to occur in places where there is a higher chance of maintaining salmon populations. There is also a huge need for science and research capability. There is a huge body of enhancement research from other jurisdictions, but less so from enhancement in the Canadian context. We just heard a lot about the Columbia watershed, and the Fraser and Skeena watersheds are very, very different in terms of the Columbia, in terms of the impacts of hydropower, of people, of forestry, and other things. And we need to understand the impacts and effects and benefits of enhancement in the context of these watersheds. We also have a very high number of smaller watersheds all across BC that either have enhancement currently or have desires from Indigenous groups or others for enhancement. And so there's a need to understand the Canadian context around the results of these interventions. We are fortunate in that we have received some funding to increase this kind of gap in Canada, and so there remains a lack of dedicated Canadian research both within DFO and within universities, but that is changing right now. So we do view hatcheries as a platform for both research, but also for large-scale experimentation. So hatcheries do offer us the ability to adapt and to use that adaptation as a trial and as experimentation to learn about these interventions and where there's an opportunity to be more effective. One last sort of major category to get into here in terms of leadership and cooperation. So a lot going on in this slide, but I kind of just want to highlight the linkage between jurisdictions and the need for cooperation. So, you know, the intent here is to look at the potential effects across the North Pacific from different enhancement decisions. And in particular, the productivity for Chinook and sockeye in southern areas compared to the productivity of pink and chum in more northern areas. And, you know, I think the key point here is that decisions across the North Pacific may have greater effects in different geographic areas, and those may worsen the effects of climate change and our ability to respond to them. And we need to work together to identify these effects and to identify potential mitigation and make difficult choices about the benefits that we're seeking from these tools. Finally, I think one of the great opportunities about getting to speak here today is the need to highlight the role of hatcheries across Canada and the US and the role we expect them to play. and the relative investment and collaboration that there is compared to other fishery management measures. So we do have quite a bit of collaboration around fisheries management, around stock assessment, but there is a need to increase the amount of joint work around the role of hatcheries and increase the profile of these tools in terms of our joint management efforts. The clear vision at senior levels in government around how this tool is being used and how we are working with other jurisdictions to meet those objectives, in my view, is something that could be improved. And that vision piece is going to need education as well for policy leaders and fishery planners, as well as stakeholders and indigenous groups. So we don't want to oversimplify the role of hatcheries and the complex problems that salmon are facing, but there is a real need to have broader conversations about how we do this collaboratively. And my slides appear to be stuck here. Apologies. There we go. Thank you again for the time to speak today, and apologies that it was a little bit jumbled. It was a very last minute substitution for me for Dave Willis, and so I hope I've made some of his key points, and just again to highlight a few key things here that I wanted to convey. And so I think those are that salmon enhancement is a tool, and we need to use that tool in a balanced way, that we can use that tool to respond to some of the challenges we are seeing, but we have to understand the risks associated with doing that. In order to do that, we are going to need a much bigger appetite for change and adapting existing programs. The future is going to be very different than the past, and we can't continue to use the past as a model in terms of the decision making around how we use these facilities. And if we want to use this tool to mitigate some of the impacts that we're seeing, it is going to need adequate investment, in particular from an infrastructure and expertise perspective. And finally, more collaboration and more clear vision for how we use this tool is certainly something that can help in this work. So hopefully that was helpful, and looking forward to the conversation and questions. Excuse me, one last quick thing before I turn it back to the moderators. Dave did have a big team that contributed to gathering the information for this presentation and some of the key ideas in it. And so those individuals are highlighted here. Thank you.
Fantastic, Adam. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you filling at the last minute, and quite a thought-provoking, interesting talk. So thank you. So at this time, we are going to take just a 5-minute break, only 5 minutes, maybe 4 minutes. I have 3:07. Let's get back right around 3:10, 3:11. So real quick stretch break, and give you a few minutes to think about questions that you'd like to enter into the Q&A. And please let us know if the question is for Bob Lackey or for Adam Silverstein. All right, we've had a stretch break, and now I will turn it over to Lori Whitecamp and Marisa Litz to lead the Q&A session. Go ahead.
So our first question is for Bob, and it seems like there's a couple people had the same question, and that is, what assumptions were people making in answering your questions? It seems like there's a lot of drivers that would affect the trajectory of wild salmon, such as continued operation of dams, increasing regional population growth and development, factors that contribute to climate change. And so the question is really, what are your views regarding key actions needed to increase the abundance and productivity of wild salmon in the Columbia?
Yeah, the question was basically is if you cut off fishing, period, cold turkey, and you cut off hatcheries cold turkey, 20 years later and onward, what would be the status of the run, which would all be wild by definition? There's elaboration in the question, and it essentially said all things being held, whatever would normally play out, the dams would play out the way they're going to play out, population growth, whatever the normal things happen within the basin would continue to happen. The only two things that would change, no fishing and no hatcheries.
So do you think that other things could potentially increase the abundance and productivity of wild salmon in the Columbia?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, the way to bring the Columbia back to 1850s level is to get rid of the people, get rid of the dams, get rid of the agriculture, get rid of the cities, water diversions. I mean, it's not a difficult technical problem. It's just a difficult political problem. But I mean, technically, it's a relatively straightforward problem.
Great.
All right, so the next question is for Adam. And in your talk, you mentioned triage. So the question is, what criteria are being considered for determining what to save and what to let go? And sort of follow up to that, what role will hatcheries play, the conservation of biodiversity versus sort of increased production?
Yeah, well, I think those are massive social questions, and I don't think there is any one criteria that is going to be, this is exactly what's going to determine how we will respond to this population or that population's needs. I think, you know, in the Canadian context, what we want is the ability to use a hatchery tool to respond to all of those situations. So in terms of a balanced program, we are going to have different needs in different geographies. There may be places where the priority is some type of harvest opportunity at the expense of wild salmon. There are other places where the preservation of a particular population's genetic strain will be the #1 priority. And there are other places where we want to have a balance where a hatchery is contributing in some way to the abundance, but not in a way that is completely compromising the wild population. And if we want to continue to use hatcheries as a strategic tool to support this variety of different objectives in different locations, then we need to have the necessary infrastructure in place to do that in advance. We can't just say, okay, let's do X, Y, or Z, and then expect that that is going to be possible. We need to be thinking in advance about the infrastructure needs, about the fish culture needs, and about the research that's necessary to do that. So there is a ton of interesting work underway, but I think that, you know, the big decisions about which populations are quote unquote saved or have more extreme measures are big social questions, and to me, I think they're best answered on a geographic basis. The answer for the Upper Fraser is going to be very different than the west coast of Vancouver Island, as an example.
Great. So our next question is for Dr. Lackey, and it comes from Joe Taddy. And he's asking really just for some insight on the rationale for people's conclusions to your question, and of the 83% who thought it really wouldn't have any benefits. What were kind of some of the major rationales behind people's thinking?
Well, that's a good question. And the way this was set up was people didn't have to justify their answer. They could just say, here's my answer. I've had 50 years experience here. This is my answer. Other people went through detailed analysis. So it was very uneven in terms of how people answered the question in terms of justification. I was surprised that it was quite this way. I mean, if I had to be kind of cavalier about it, I would say, and it's not necessarily my personal opinion, it's just reading this 58 respondents, what I think the experts said. Hey, basically what wild fish you got are only wild in the nominal sense of the word. They're essentially hatchery strays that spawned. You take away the hatcheries, and you're going to pretty much have the number of wild fish you're going to have. Otherwise, good luck with that. There's probably nothing in the Columbia Basin that's truly wild in a classic sense. I mean, there's really no pure strains anymore. They've been mixed all around. So pretty much you have what you have. And if you get rid of the hatcheries, you'll have what you would normally have, a wild run about the size it is now. That to me was a little surprising.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, Adam, we have a really thoughtful question from Steve Latham. So wants to thank you for your presentations, and it kind of made him think about the way hatchery success has been measured in the past. So some metrics that have been used are cost per recruit, so purely financial. Other metrics have been effective number of breeders, so the returns. So are there important metrics regarding salmon enhancement that are currently being ignored or could be used to define success?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a great question and a really tricky one. My own view on this is that you have to start with your objective in order to measure success. So you have to be very, very clear for every line of production from your hatchery programming on what the objective is you're seeking. And in Canada, we have 4 main objectives around our hatchery programming. So harvest, either direct or indirect, stock assessment, conservation and rebuilding, or stewardship. And what we want to do is to transition to be much more specific about those objectives and quantified in those objectives so that we can have better metrics to determine that success, and also to judge the trade-offs we're making to get to that success. So, the current perspective might be, okay, this particular line of production, this particular harvest, our production is to support harvest. Are people fishing? Yes, check, we've done our job. And, that could be refined around very specifically what types of harvest, in what amounts and in what locations. And then what are the impacts that are associated with that in terms of bycatch on other stocks and things of that nature. So to me, the measuring of success depends greatly on the objectives, and then also on understanding what the trade-offs are associated with in meeting that objective. And that is a huge part of the work that we're doing now around our hatchery adaptation strategy to improve the setting of objectives across our hatchery programming and the measurement of trade-offs like genetic impacts, like straying, things of that nature.
Great. I have a question actually for Dr. Lackey, and that is, given the kind of the prediction for what would happen with hatchery production, have you heard of people trying to do kind of basin-wide, within a tributary, large tributary, closing down all the hatcheries or stopping production for X number of years to see what kind of response there is? Certainly Oregon Coast Coho is an example of that, but I was just wondering if within the Columbia, you've heard of any efforts to really test this.
Well, I mean, people like you and I talk about that every once in a while, but real people in the world, that's a non-starter. I mean, I give a talk and I try to be pretty policy neutral. Hey, these are the facts as I see it. I'm like, God, I get the nastiest emails from everything from Trout Unlimited to the tribes to state agencies, the wild fish people, the Native Fish Society. I don't think it has any supporters at all. I mean, you talk about reducing hatchery operations, and I went out when they first did the Canadian wild salmon policy for the public hearings in the early 2000s. Like, I was in Prince George at UNBC, and the fishermen there, I was sitting in the back row trying to be unobtrusive, which is very hard for a professor. But anyway, I tried to blend in, and they basically said, you can do anything you want, DFO. Great, no problem. We love this program. Just don't let it interfere with our fishing, period. I mean, that's essentially their view. And their fishing is hatcheries. So that's my take on it.
So I have a follow-up to that question from Lori in your response, Bob. So you mention in your talk, the Yeager and Sherrill recent paper essentially concluded there's been net zero return on $9 billion of investment in salmon recovery. And, the analysis was really broad brush. It was across the basin. It looked at, returns to Bonneville as sort of a metric of success. And, a lot of these populations that are below Bonneville, like Lori mentioned, the Oregon Coast Coho, Lower Columbia Chum, they might tell a different story based on the recovery. So do you stand by that conclusion that there's been zero return on investment for salmon recovery in the Columbia?
Well, you have a lot of stuff packed in that question. I mean, anyway, I want to correct one point. It's $9 billion, not million. Million would be a steal, but it's $9 billion. Serious money. Anything on the coast, I put in a different category because there are potentials on the coast, Oregon, Washington, BC. There are definitely potentials there, so that's a different thing. I mean, there's been some people in the Salmon 2100 project that said, a logical thing for society would do to take these billions of dollars you're spending in the Columbia and spend them along the coast because you could do some good there. That's a non-starter. Obviously, the people in the Columbia River Basin, forget it. That's our money. Don't even think about it. The other thing is there's not actually much. I mean, you got a small number of rivers and below Bonneville, but Bonneville is a good baseline. And now the other thing which I would challenge on is not to say that on a local basis there are not effects on salmon. And actually, Yeager did say that. There are definitely effects. You can go into a stream, knock out a dam, and you can have some effects. Elwha, not in the Columbia, but that idea, you can have some effects. But overall, if you're an Office of Management budget, you look at the $9 billion, the things you said you were going to do, you didn't do. And so there's no demonstrated positive benefit of those $9 billion you spent based against the things you said you were going to do.
It's pretty staggering. Quick question for Dave. One last question. Looking at the current and future climate conditions, is it time for Canada or British Columbia to review its wild salmon policy to deal with salmon stocks and perhaps change expectations a little bit?
Yeah, I guess Joe Tatey did put a bit of an answer to the chat on this one here, and I would tend to agree with him in the context that the general policy and the types of things it considers and defines doesn't need a significant rework. It was reviewed actually not that long ago, in the late around the 2018 timeframe, if I recall, and some adjustments were made. But really, I think the challenge there is in looking forward in terms of what our objectives are in a very, very different climate than the past, and how are we using tools like those policy approaches that define what are wild salmon. The policy does talk about the role for enhancement in meeting the public's objectives for salmon. So to me, I think it is more about how we use these tools to address the challenges we have going forward. I think the concept that a lot of people put towards rebuilding is really challenging, right? There isn't a universe where we're going back to the way it was. There are only more people and more impacts coming. How do we want to use the policy, the tools we have like enhancement, like habitat restoration, like fisheries management to respond to these different things we're saying and still maintain some benefits for all the residents in these areas? Is there a way to even do that? I think is the challenge that we have today.
So Adam, in your talk, you gave a really great overview of the enhancements that are needed for hatchery infrastructure to make things, resilient in the future. those things are going to cost a heck of a lot of money. So is there, what is the strategy? What is the plan from DFO to fund, you know, this research, this hatchery infrastructure upgrades, all of these sort of desired climate resiliency programs?
Well, that's always the $1 million question. I think we're fortunate right now in that we're in the middle of a 5-year period with a historic investment in our hatchery programming and in salmon management programming in BC. That is the first really significant investment in my 25-year career in this work. And so we are building some new hatchery infrastructure right now, and we're looking to adjust existing hatchery infrastructure to the extent we can with those resources to be more focused on conservation and rebuilding, to be more focused on targeted harvest. We do have a number of initiatives with that funding to initiate new research to help support our monitoring tools for Hatchery-Wild interactions. So I don't know if people want me to list off all the different things that that current funding environment is paying, but you know, there is no doubt that these things cost a lot of money. Hatchery operations are much more challenging than a lot of other things the government can do and invest in, right? It requires 24/7, 365 operations in most cases. Fuel, fish, food, electricity costs more every year, and most government programs don't get more money every year. But if we are looking at salmon management challenges and we're looking at the levers that we have to provide opportunities for people to continue to have salmon in rivers as the world is changing dramatically here. Salmon enhancement is one of the levers that we have to use. And to me, I think the question is about how do we use that tool and what are the trade-offs associated with that? Unlike, let's say, let's close a fishery or let's do some habitat restoration, those things can happen relatively quickly. Enhancement takes infrastructure, it takes time. And so if we want to use this tool effectively going forward in the future, we need to plan for it and prepare for it.
Great. Well, we have come to the end of our time, and I just want to thank our speakers again for really very thought-provoking talks from both speakers. It was really excellent. We have a couple more questions, but we will send those to the speakers and hopefully you can answer them, and we'll have that posted on the website. Our next presentation or seminar is going to be January 9th in Seattle at the PSC meeting. And it's going to be a panel discussion on kind of the future of fisheries. So we hope you make it. And the recording of this talk should be available within a couple days on the PSC website. So thank you all for attending and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks all. Thanks to our speakers.
Thank you.